Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey into the darkest corners of medieval history. Tonight, we're diving into something that'll make your wedding planning stress look absolutely trivial. So grab your favorite drink, dim those lights, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always wild to see who's brave enough to join me for these late-night historical deep dives. If you think modern dating is complicated, wait until you hear about medieval Europe, where love didn't always require both parties to be breathing. Before you click away thinking this is some horror movie plot, let me tell you something that'll blow your mind. People actually married dead bodies in medieval times. Not as a joke, not as some weird cult practice, but as legitimate legal ceremonies recognized by communities and sometimes even blessed by priests. This isn't fiction. This isn't folklore. This is documented history that somehow got buried deeper than the corpses involved. So buckle up, because we're about to explore 10 segments of the most bizarre, shocking, and surprisingly logical practice you've probably never heard of. Number 1. The forgotten practice of posthumous marriage. Picture this. You're a medieval peasant, maybe a minor noble, and you've just received the worst news possible. Your fiancé, the person you were supposed to marry next month, has died suddenly. In our modern world, you'd grieve, maybe wear black for a while, and eventually move on. But in medieval Europe, you had another option. You could still have that wedding. Welcome to the world of posthumous marriage, or as some scholars call it, necrogamy. This wasn't some underground cult practice or the stuff of gothic horror stories. This was a real, documented phenomenon that occurred across medieval Europe from roughly the 10th to the 16th centuries. And before you assume it was just crazy people doing crazy things, let me tell you something that might surprise you. These ceremonies often made perfect sense. The medieval world was obsessed with contracts, oaths, and binding agreements. Marriage wasn't just about love. It was about property, alliances, family honor, and legal obligations. When someone died before a planned wedding, it didn't automatically cancel all those arrangements. Imagine you've already paid the dowry, signed the contracts, and announced the union to your entire village. Death might part the soul from the body, but it didn't necessarily void a legal agreement. These posthumous marriages happened for several reasons that made sense to medieval minds. Sometimes a couple had already made vows privately before witnesses, what we'd call a handfasting or betrothal. If one person died before the church ceremony, the surviving partner might argue they were already married in God's eyes. Other times, pregnancy was involved. A woman carrying a child needed legitimacy for her offspring, and marrying the dead father solved multiple problems at once. The practice was especially common during times of war and plague. The Black Death swept through Europe multiple times, and wars could drag on for decades. Young men would go off to fight, make promises to their sweethearts, and never come home. But sometimes their bodies did. And sometimes, those bodies came with enough legal documentation to prove a marriage contract had existed. What's fascinating is how practical medieval people were about death. They lived with it daily. Child mortality was high, plagues were frequent, and violence was common. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes like today. It was part of life. So the idea of having a ceremony with a corpse wasn't as shocking to them as it is to us. They saw bodies regularly, prepared them for burial, and held wakes that lasted days. The ceremonies themselves varied widely. Sometimes it was a simple blessing over the corpse and the living spouse. Other times, it was a full wedding ceremony complete with witnesses, vows, and even a feast afterward. The dead person would be dressed in wedding clothes, positioned carefully, and treated as if they were simply sleeping through their own wedding. But here's where it gets really interesting. These marriages weren't just about emotion or tradition. They had real legal consequences. A posthumous marriage could legitimize children, transfer property, create alliances between families, and even affect inheritance rights for generations. In a world where your family name and social status determined everything about your life, these ceremonies were often matters of survival. The practice was most common in France, parts of Germany, and some Nordic regions, though scattered examples appear throughout Christian Europe. It seemed to follow certain patterns related to local laws and customs. Areas with strong feudal systems and complex inheritance laws saw more posthumous marriages than regions with simpler legal structures. Church records from this period are frustratingly incomplete, But the ones that survive paint a picture of communities that accepted these ceremonies as unusual but legitimate. Parish priests wrote about them in the same matter-of-fact tone they used for regular weddings, noting the date, the witnesses, and the legal arrangements involved. What's important to understand is that this wasn't necrophilia or some form of sexual perversion. These were legal and social ceremonies designed to solve practical problems. The living spouse wasn't planning to consummate anything. They were planning to inherit something, legitimize something, or honor something. The medieval mind could separate the legal reality of marriage from its physical aspects in ways that seem foreign to us today. By the time we reached the Renaissance, attitudes were already changing. The rise of more centralized governments, standardized legal codes, and reformed church practices began to squeeze out these unusual customs. But for several centuries, marrying a dead body was just another option in the complex medieval toolkit for managing family, property, and social obligations. Number 2. Laws and loopholes that allowed it. If you think the legal system today has loopholes, you haven't seen anything yet. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of overlapping authorities, competing legal traditions, and enough bureaucratic confusion to make a modern lawyer weep with joy. And somewhere in that maze of feudal law, canon law, and local custom, there were gaps wide enough to drive a funeral cart through. The foundation of posthumous marriage lay in how medieval society understood contracts and consent. Under Roman law, which still influenced much of medieval legal thinking, a marriage was essentially a contract between two parties. But here's the key point that opens our first loophole. Many legal scholars argued that once consent had been given, even verbally and before witnesses, a valid marriage existed regardless of whether a formal ceremony had taken place. Canon law, the legal system of the Catholic Church, added another layer of complexity. The Church taught that marriage was a sacrament, yes, but also that it could be valid even without priestly blessing if the couple had genuinely consented before God. This created a gray area. If a couple had exchanged vows privately, what we might call a common law marriage today, then one person's death didn't necessarily invalidate what had already been blessed by divine witness. Feudal law provided even more opportunities. The feudal system was built on personal oaths and obligations. A lord's vassal didn't just owe military service, he owed it to that specific person. When marriage contracts involved land transfers, military obligations, or alliance agreements, the death of one party could throw entire political arrangements into chaos. Posthumous marriage offered a way to honor the original contract while adapting to new circumstances. Local customs varied wildly across medieval Europe, but many regions had traditions that recognized marriages as valid if certain conditions had been met, regardless of whether both parties were alive for a formal ceremony. Some areas required only that the couple had publicly announced their intention to marry. Others required evidence of sexual relations or cohabitation. Still others focused on whether dowries had been exchanged or contracts signed. The concept of sponsalia per verba de futuro versus sponsalia per verba de presenti created particularly fertile ground for posthumous marriage. The first meant a promise to marry in the future, while the second meant a declaration that marriage already existed in the present. If a couple had exchanged verba de presenti vows, many legal experts argued that death couldn't dissolve what God had already joined, even if the formal church blessing hadn't occurred yet. Property law provided the strongest legal foundation for posthumous marriages. Medieval society was obsessed with legitimate inheritance. Bastard children could inherit under some circumstances, but legitimate children almost always had stronger claims. If a woman was pregnant when her partner died, marrying his corpse could legitimize their child and secure its inheritance rights. The alternative might be poverty and social disgrace. Military law offered another pathway. Soldiers often made deathbed requests that their bodies be returned home for burial beside their betrothed. Sometimes these requests included provisions for posthumous marriage ceremonies. Military commanders, understanding the importance of morale and the need to honor fallen soldiers, often supported these arrangements. A dead hero married to his sweetheart became a symbol of honor and sacrifice. The legal principle of fiction of law allowed courts to treat certain situations as if they were different from reality for the sake of justice. If a posthumous marriage served the greater good, protected children, preserved property rights, or honored legitimate agreements, Legal experts could invoke this principle to justify unusual procedures. They weren't pretending the dead person was alive, but they were treating the marriage contract as if it had been completed before death occurred. Marriage law in medieval Europe also recognized something called matrimonium presumptum, or presumed marriage. If a couple had lived together openly, shared property, and been treated as married by their community, the law might presume a valid marriage existed even without formal ceremony. Death didn't necessarily destroy this presumption, especially if other evidence supported the claim. Different regions developed their own specific provisions. Norman law in England recognized certain forms of posthumous marriage for inheritance purposes. Germanic legal traditions included provisions for honoring the wishes of dying warriors. French customary law developed elaborate procedures for validating marriages where one party had died between betrothal and ceremony. The Church's own internal laws contained contradictions that clever legal minds could exploit. While canon law generally required both parties to be alive and consenting, it also taught that marriage was a spiritual bond that death could not sever. If the spiritual bond existed, why couldn't it be formally recognized even after physical death? Interestingly, these legal loopholes persisted partly because they served everyone's interests. Families avoided property disputes. Lords maintained political alliances. The Church avoided illegitimate children. Communities avoided social disruption. And lawyers found plenty of work navigating the complex procedures required to make these marriages legally binding. The documentation requirements for posthumous marriages were actually quite strict in many regions. Witnesses had to testify about prior agreements. Property inventories had to be compiled. Family histories had to be researched. The legal process was often more complex than a normal wedding, precisely because the stakes were higher and the situation more unusual. By the late medieval period, some regions had developed specific legal codes governing posthumous marriage. These weren't accidents or oversights, but deliberate policy decisions. Lawmakers recognized that these ceremonies solved real problems and served legitimate purposes, even if they seemed unusual to outsiders. Number 3. Royalty and nobles leading the way. When you're talking about medieval politics, everything comes down to bloodlines, territory, and alliances. And nothing, not even death itself, could be allowed to disrupt the carefully orchestrated game of noble marriages that kept kingdoms stable and families in power. So when a prince died before his wedding, or a duchess passed away after betrothal but before the ceremony, the surviving family didn't just shrug and move on. They got creative. The most documented cases of posthumous marriage involve the nobility because, frankly, they're the only ones whose weddings were important enough for multiple scribes to record in detail. Royal chroniclers didn't bother writing down every peasant's unusual wedding, but when a duke married a dead duchess, that made it into the official histories. One of the most fascinating cases comes from 12th century France, during the reign of Louis VII. A minor noble named Guillaume de Montfort was betrothed to Isabelle de Vermandois, a match that would have united two important territories and secured crucial military alliances. The betrothal contracts were signed, dowries exchanged, and wedding plans finalized. Then Isabelle died of fever just weeks before the ceremony. Guillaume faced a dilemma. The political alliance was still desperately needed. Isabelle's family controlled strategic castles along contested borders. Her dowry included valuable trade routes. And Guillaume had already borrowed heavily against his future wife's income to fund his own military campaigns. Walking away from the marriage would mean financial ruin and political isolation. The solution was elegant in its medieval logic. Guillaume petitioned the local bishop for permission to marry Isabelle's body, arguing that their betrothal had been blessed by God and that death should not void divine approval. The bishop, after consulting with canon law experts and probably receiving some generous donations, agreed. The ceremony took place in the family chapel with Isabelle's preserved body dressed in silk and positioned carefully in a chair beside the altar. But this wasn't just about romance or honor. The posthumous marriage allowed Guillaume to claim Isabelle's dowry, inherit her lands, and maintain the military alliance her family represented. Within 6 months, he had remarried a living woman, but the political benefits of his first marriage to a corpse lasted for decades. Similar cases appeared throughout medieval Europe. In Germany, The Holy Roman Empire's complex inheritance laws created situations where posthumous marriages were almost necessary for political stability. When Duke Heinrich of Saxony's son died before marrying the daughter of a powerful Bavarian family, the alliance was too important to abandon. The young woman, whose name sadly wasn't preserved in most records, agreed to marry the corpse in order to secure her own family's position and maintain the planned union between the duchies. The English nobility developed their own variations. During the civil wars of the 12th century, known as the Anarchy, several documented cases involve posthumous marriages designed to legitimize children and secure inheritance claims. When Robert Fitzwalter's heir died in battle after hand-fasting, but before formal marriage, his pregnant partner was married to his body in a ceremony witnessed by 3 bishops and recorded in multiple chronicles. The resulting child inherited substantial lands that might otherwise have been contested for generations. Spanish nobility, with their complex codes of honor and elaborate inheritance traditions, may have produced the most ritualized posthumous marriage ceremonies. The Chronicle of Alfonso X describes a case where a Castilian nobleman's daughter was married to the preserved body of her betrothed after he died in the Reconquista campaigns. The ceremony lasted 3 days, involved elaborate processions, and included formal exchanges of property deeds between the families. What's particularly interesting about noble posthumous marriages is how they were used to solve succession crises. Medieval inheritance law could be incredibly complex, especially when multiple claimants existed or when property had to pass through female lines. A posthumous marriage could clarify these situations by creating clear legal relationships between families. The Byzantine Empire, with its mix of Roman law and Christian theology, developed perhaps the most sophisticated legal framework for posthumous marriages among the nobility. Imperial chronicles record several cases where posthumous marriages were used to legitimize the children of concubines, transfer property between allied families, and even resolve diplomatic disputes with foreign powers. Nordic nobility had their own traditions, often tied to their warrior culture. Icelandic sagas mention posthumous marriages between warriors who died in battle and the women who had sworn to them. These weren't just ceremonies, but legal proceedings that could affect property rights, family alliances, and even the obligation to pursue blood feuds against the enemies who had killed the groom. The Italian city-states, with their merchant nobility and complex banking arrangements, used posthumous marriages to resolve financial disputes. When a wealthy merchant died before marrying his betrothed, but after significant financial arrangements had been made, a posthumous marriage could clarify who owed what to whom and prevent costly legal battles. Noble families also used posthumous marriages strategically to enhance their prestige. Marrying a dead hero was different from marrying a living coward. If a young nobleman died gloriously in battle or on crusade, his posthumous marriage could become a symbol of family honor that lasted for generations. The ceremony protocols for noble posthumous marriages were elaborate affairs. The body had to be preserved, often through embalming techniques that were expensive and required specialized knowledge. Wedding clothes had to be specially designed to fit a corpse. Witnesses had to include people of sufficient rank to make the marriage legally unquestionable. The timing of these ceremonies was also crucial. Bodies had to be in good enough condition for the ceremony, but legal requirements often took weeks to fulfill. Noble families developed networks of priests, lawyers, and embalmers who could work together to arrange posthumous marriages on short notice. These royal and noble posthumous marriages established precedents that trickled down through medieval society. When common people saw that dukes and counts could marry dead bodies with the church's blessing, they began to view the practice as legitimate for their own families. The nobility didn't just participate in posthumous marriage, they made it socially acceptable. Number 4. The Church's complicated role. The Catholic Church's relationship with posthumous marriage was like a medieval soap opera, full of contradictions, secret meetings, and public pronouncements that said one thing, while private actions did another. On paper, the Church taught that marriage required 2 living, consenting adults. In practice, they found themselves blessing ceremonies where one of those adults was decidedly non-responsive. The theological problem was obvious. Christian marriage was supposed to be a sacrament, a sacred bond blessed by God and witnessed by the community. How could a corpse consent to anything? How could a dead person participate in a sacrament? These weren't just academic questions for medieval theologians. They were practical problems that parish priests faced when noble families showed up with a body and demanded a wedding ceremony. The church's initial response was predictably bureaucratic. They formed committees. In the 11th century, several church councils discussed posthumous marriage, producing documents that managed to be both definitive and completely unclear. The Council of Trent would eventually address some of these issues, but for centuries, individual bishops and priests were left to make their own decisions. Some church leaders took a hard line against the practice. They argued that marriage was for the living, that sacraments required active participation from both parties, and that ceremonies with corpses bordered on necromancy. These clerics refused to perform posthumous marriages and sometimes excommunicated those who participated in them. But other church officials saw the bigger picture. Medieval Europe was a violent, unpredictable place. Plague, war, and sudden death could destroy family alliances and political stability overnight. Posthumous marriages weren't just unusual ceremonies. They were tools for maintaining social order. A bishop who refused to bless these unions might find himself dealing with bastard children, property disputes, and political chaos. The theological justification that many church leaders settled on was ingenious in its complexity. They argued that marriage was a contract as well as a sacrament. If the contract had been validly made before witnesses while both parties lived, then the sacramental aspect could be conferred posthumously without requiring new consent from the deceased. This distinction between the contractual and sacramental aspects of marriage allowed the church to have it both ways. They could maintain their theology about living consent while still blessing posthumous ceremonies that served legitimate social purposes. The dead person had already consented when alive. The church was simply recognizing and blessing a union that had already been made valid by prior agreement. Regional variations in church practice were enormous. French bishops developed elaborate procedures for investigating posthumous marriage claims, requiring testimony from multiple witnesses about prior betrothal agreements. German church leaders focused more on the legitimacy of any children involved. English clergy often deferred to local nobles and civil authorities, blessing what had already been decided by secular courts. The church also distinguished between different types of posthumous marriages. Ceremonies designed to legitimize children received more support than those aimed purely at property transfer. Marriages that honored the wishes of dead crusaders or military heroes were blessed more readily than those that seemed motivated by greed. Some of the most interesting church documents from this period are the private letters between bishops discussing posthumous marriage cases. These letters reveal clergy who were genuinely trying to balance competing theological, legal, and pastoral concerns. They knew these ceremonies were unusual, but they also recognized their social importance. The church's record-keeping became part of the legitimacy of posthumous marriages. A ceremony performed by a priest and recorded in parish registers carried much more legal weight than one conducted by secular authorities alone. Families sought church blessing not just for theological reasons, but because church records provided the strongest evidence of the marriage's validity. Monastic communities played a special role in posthumous marriages. Monasteries often had the resources to preserve bodies for extended periods, the scholarly expertise to research legal precedents, and the political independence to make controversial decisions. Several documented posthumous marriages took place in monastery chapels, with abbots serving as both religious and legal authorities. The church also developed specific rituals for posthumous marriages that differed from regular wedding ceremonies. These typically emphasized prayers for the dead, blessings for the living spouse, and formal recognition of pre-existing agreements rather than the exchange of new vows. The ceremonies were solemn rather than celebratory, focused on legal and spiritual necessity rather than joy. Confessional records, where they survive, show that some clergy struggled with their participation in posthumous marriages. Priests wrote about their uncertainty, their prayers for guidance, and their attempts to balance competing obligations. They weren't mindlessly following tradition, they were making difficult decisions in complex situations. The church's attitude toward posthumous marriage began to shift during the later medieval period. The rise of more centralized church authority, standardized canon law, and reformed theological education gradually squeezed out local variations in practice. What had once been a matter for individual bishops became subject to universal church law. But even as official church policy moved against posthumous marriages, individual clergy continued to perform them in special circumstances. The gap between official teaching and pastoral practice persisted well into the Renaissance period, reflecting the Church's ongoing struggle to balance theological purity with practical necessity. The Church's complicated role in posthumous marriages reveals something important about medieval Christianity. This wasn't a rigid, inflexible institution imposing uniform practices across Europe. It was a complex organization trying to serve the spiritual and practical needs of diverse communities facing real-world problems. Sometimes that meant blessing unusual ceremonies that met legitimate needs, even when those ceremonies challenged conventional theology. Number 5. Dowries, property, and dead spouses. Money talks, even when one party to the conversation can't talk back. Medieval Europe ran on property, inheritance, and economic alliances that could span generations. When death interrupted these carefully planned financial arrangements, families didn't just write off their investments. They found ways to make dead bodies legally profitable. Understanding medieval economics is crucial to understanding posthumous marriage. This wasn't a romantic society where people married for love and figured out the practical details later. Marriage was a business transaction with romantic elements, not the other way around. Dowries were paid, properties transferred, and economic obligations created that couldn't easily be undone just because one party happened to die. The dowry system created the perfect storm for posthumous marriages. When a medieval family negotiated their daughter's marriage, they weren't just finding her a husband. They were making a major financial investment. Dowries could include land, money, livestock, business interests, and valuable goods. These payments were often made in installments over months or years, with the largest portions typically transferred at the actual wedding ceremony. But what happened when the groom died after the betrothal but before the wedding? The bride's family had already made significant payments and commitments. The groom's family had already adjusted their financial planning based on expected dowry income. Both families had made agreements with third parties, borrowed money, and rearranged their economic affairs. Walking away from the marriage meant financial disaster for everyone involved. Posthumous marriage offered a solution that satisfied everyone's economic interests. The bride could marry the corpse, making the dowry payments legally valid and transferring the agreed-upon property to the groom's family. In return, she could claim widow's rights, including dower lands and other properties that would support her for life. Both families avoided the financial chaos of a canceled marriage contract. The property implications were staggering. A successful posthumous marriage could transfer ownership of lands, houses, businesses, and valuable goods worth thousands of pounds in medieval currency. These weren't trivial amounts. Some posthumous marriage ceremonies involved property transfers equivalent to millions of dollars in today's money. Inheritance law created additional economic incentives for posthumous marriage. Medieval society was obsessed with legitimate heirs and clear property succession. Illegitimate children could inherit under some circumstances, but legitimate children had stronger claims and fewer restrictions. If a woman was pregnant when her partner died, marrying his corpse could legitimize their child and secure its inheritance rights to substantial family wealth. The timing of these economic transfers was crucial. Medieval property law often required specific procedures to be followed in precise order. Dowries had to be paid before property could be transferred. Marriage ceremonies had to occur before dower rights could be claimed. If someone died in the middle of this process, posthumous marriage allowed families to complete the required legal steps in the correct sequence. Military service obligations created another layer of economic complexity. In the feudal system, land ownership often came with military obligations. A knight who held land from a lord owed military service, which could be expensive and dangerous. When a betrothed couple included lands with military obligations, the death of one partner could disrupt military planning and alliance structures. Posthumous marriage allowed these obligations to be transferred properly, maintaining feudal relationships that were crucial for military defense. Trade agreements and business partnerships were also affected by posthumous marriages. Medieval merchants often arranged marriages between their children to cement business relationships, share trade routes, and combine resources for major ventures. When death disrupted these arrangements, posthumous marriage could preserve valuable business relationships and honor existing commercial agreements. The role of women in these economic arrangements was more complex than you might expect. While medieval women had fewer legal rights than men, they could own property, inherit land, and manage business affairs under certain circumstances. A posthumous marriage could actually increase a woman's economic independence by making her a legitimate widow with clear property rights rather than a rejected fiancé with no legal claims. Documentation of these economic arrangements shows that posthumous marriages were often more expensive than regular weddings. The legal procedures were complex, requiring lawyers, notaries, and court officials. Bodies had to be preserved, which required expensive embalming. Wedding ceremonies had to be elaborate enough to satisfy legal requirements for legitimacy. All of these costs were usually worth it because the property at stake was so valuable. Some posthumous marriages were purely economic arrangements with no pretense of romance or honor. Wealthy families used them as sophisticated financial instruments to transfer property, avoid taxes, and manipulate inheritance law. These ceremonies were business meetings with dead bodies, conducted with the same attention to detail as any major financial transaction. The church's role in these economic arrangements was also significant. Church blessing of a posthumous marriage could affect property rights for generations. Church records provided legal evidence that was difficult to challenge. And church officials often had their own financial interests in these ceremonies, receiving donations and fees that could be substantial. Regional variations in property law created different incentives for posthumous marriage across medieval Europe. Some areas had laws that strongly favored male heirs, making posthumous marriage crucial for women seeking to claim inheritance rights. Other regions had more flexible inheritance customs that made these ceremonies less economically necessary. The long-term economic effects of posthumous marriages could last for centuries. Property transferred through these ceremonies became part of family estates that passed down through generations. Some of the great noble houses of medieval Europe owed parts of their wealth to successful posthumous marriages that had secured crucial property rights decades or centuries earlier. By the later medieval period, some regions had developed specific tax and legal provisions for posthumous marriages, recognizing them as legitimate economic instruments rather than just unusual ceremonies. This legal recognition made these marriages even more attractive as financial planning tools for wealthy families. Number 6. Rituals and ceremonies with a corpse. The logistics alone should have been enough to discourage anyone. How do you dress a corpse for a wedding? How do you position a dead body for a ceremony? How do you manage a formal event where one of the main participants can't walk, talk, or even stand up without help? Medieval Europeans figured it all out, and the details are both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The first challenge was preservation. Medieval Europe didn't have modern embalming techniques, refrigeration, or funeral homes. Bodies decomposed quickly, especially in warm weather or during summer months. Families planning posthumous marriages had to work fast, but they also needed time to arrange the legal and religious aspects of the ceremony. The solution was a combination of techniques borrowed from religious relic preservation and practical mortuary care. Wealthy families could afford professional embalmers, often monks or physicians who had learned preservation techniques through caring for religious relics or preparing bodies for long-distance transport. The process typically involved removing internal organs, treating the body with preservative herbs and oils, and wrapping it in treated cloth. The goal wasn't permanent preservation, just maintaining the body's appearance long enough for a dignified ceremony. Dressing the corpse required special techniques and specially designed clothing. Wedding garments had to be constructed differently to accommodate a body that couldn't move or be positioned normally. Seamstresses and tailors developed methods for creating beautiful wedding clothes that could be put on a corpse and would look appropriate during the ceremony. The clothing often included extra support structures, padding, and strategic design elements that maintained the illusion of a living person from a distance. The most challenging aspect was positioning the body during the ceremony. Dead bodies don't sit up, stand, or maintain formal postures. Medieval families developed various techniques for supporting corpses during posthumous marriage ceremonies. Some used specially constructed chairs with hidden supports that held the body upright. Others positioned the corpse lying down but arranged the ceremony so that this appeared dignified rather than morbid. Church architecture played a role in these ceremonies. Many medieval churches had raised altar areas, tomb niches, or special chapels that could accommodate unusual ceremony arrangements. Some families actually modified church layouts temporarily, building platforms or screens that allowed the corpse to be positioned appropriately while maintaining the dignity of the ceremony. The ceremony itself followed modified versions of traditional wedding liturgy. Priests developed special variations of marriage ceremonies that acknowledged the unique circumstances while maintaining the essential religious elements. These typically included prayers for the dead, blessings for the living spouse, and formal recognition of pre-existing agreements rather than the exchange of new vows. Witnesses played a crucial role in posthumous marriage ceremonies. Because the legitimacy of these marriages could be challenged later, families needed credible witnesses who could testify about what they had seen and heard. The witness list for a posthumous marriage often included more people than a regular wedding, and these witnesses were chosen specifically for their social standing and credibility. The timing of posthumous marriage ceremonies was carefully planned around the practical realities of death and decomposition. Most ceremonies took place within days of death, before decomposition made the body unsuitable for public display. However, the legal requirements often took time to fulfill, creating pressure to work quickly while maintaining dignity and proper procedures. Music and other ceremonial elements were adapted for the solemn nature of posthumous marriages. These weren't celebrations in the usual sense, but formal religious and legal proceedings that acknowledged death while affirming life and continuity. The musical selections, decorations, and ceremonial elements reflected this balance between mourning and affirmation. The role of the living spouse varied depending on local customs and specific circumstances. Some ceremonies required active participation from the surviving partner, including formal vows and responses. Others treated the living person more as a witness to the completion of pre-existing agreements. The ceremony had to balance the need for legal validity with respect for the emotional state of someone who was simultaneously getting married and attending a funeral. Regional variations in ceremonial practice were significant. French posthumous marriages often emphasized elaborate processions and formal property transfers. Germanic traditions focused more on military honors and warrior themes. Nordic ceremonies incorporated elements from traditional death rituals and saga traditions. The feast or celebration after posthumous marriage ceremonies was particularly complex. How do you celebrate a wedding when one spouse is dead? Different communities handled this differently. Some held solemn meals that were more like funeral gatherings. Others celebrated the legal resolution and the honor shown to the deceased. The social dynamics of these gatherings reflected the complex emotions surrounding posthumous marriage. Documentation of these ceremonies was extensive, partly because their unusual nature made them memorable and partly because their legal significance required careful record-keeping. Parish registers, family chronicles, and legal documents preserve detailed descriptions of posthumous marriage ceremonies that provide insight into both the practical logistics and the cultural meaning of these events. The psychological impact on participants was significant. Priests, family members, and witnesses had to balance respect for the dead with the practical requirements of a legal ceremony. Many accounts describe the emotional intensity of these events, where grief, legal necessity, and social obligation created complex psychological dynamics for everyone involved. Some posthumous marriage ceremonies became community events that drew large crowds of curious observers. These weren't private family affairs, but public ceremonies that demonstrated the family's honor, wealth, and commitment to fulfilling their obligations. The spectacle of a wedding with a corpse could enhance a family's reputation for reliability and honor. The cleanup and aftermath of posthumous marriage ceremonies required special attention. Bodies that had been preserved for the ceremony still needed proper burial afterward. Wedding decorations and ceremonial items had to be handled appropriately, with some items buried with the corpse and others preserved as family heirlooms or legal evidence. By the later medieval period, some regions had developed standardized procedures for posthumous marriage ceremonies, complete with official guidelines for preservation, positioning, witnessing, and documentation. These weren't improvised rituals, but formal procedures with established protocols that had evolved over generations of practice. Number 7. community reactions, and superstitions. Medieval communities weren't just passive observers when someone decided to marry a dead body. They had opinions, fears, and beliefs that could make or break these unusual ceremonies. The reaction of neighbors, friends, and local authorities often determined whether a posthumous marriage was seen as honorable, necessary, or absolutely terrifying. The first thing to understand is that medieval people lived much closer to death than we do today. They prepared bodies for burial, held wakes in their homes, and dealt with mortality as a regular part of life. This familiarity with death made posthumous marriages less shocking than they might seem to modern observers, but it also made people more aware of the spiritual and supernatural implications. Many communities viewed posthumous marriages through the lens of honor and duty. If a family fulfilled their obligations to a dead son or daughter by completing a promised marriage, that was seen as admirable. These families were keeping their word, honoring agreements, and showing respect for the deceased. Communities that valued loyalty and family honor often supported posthumous marriages as demonstrations of good character. But other communities reacted with suspicion and fear. The medieval world was full of superstitions about disturbing the dead, interfering with natural order, and attracting supernatural attention. Some people believed that holding elaborate ceremonies with corpses could disturb the rest of the dead, attract evil spirits, or bring bad luck to the entire community. Religious beliefs created additional complexity in community reactions. While some saw posthumous marriage as a Christian duty to honor agreements made before God, others viewed it as an unholy interference with divine will. If God had chosen to end someone's life before their wedding, some argued, then human attempts to complete that marriage were acts of defiance against divine judgment. The economic impact of posthumous marriages on local communities influenced reactions significantly. These ceremonies often involved substantial spending on preservation, ceremony, and celebration. Local merchants, craftsmen, and service providers could benefit financially from the elaborate preparations required. Communities that profited from these events were more likely to support them than those that saw them as wasteful or inappropriate. Social class played a major role in community reactions. When nobles or wealthy merchants arranged posthumous marriages, communities often viewed them as legitimate exercises of privilege and responsibility. These families had the resources to arrange proper ceremonies and the social standing to make their actions seem respectable. But when common people attempted posthumous marriages, community reactions could be much more skeptical. Fear of contagion was another factor in community reactions. Medieval people understood that diseases could spread from dead bodies, and communities that had experienced plague outbreaks were particularly nervous about ceremonies that involved prolonged exposure to corpses. Some communities supported posthumous marriages only if strict health precautions were observed. The legal implications of posthumous marriages also affected community attitudes. If these ceremonies could affect property ownership, inheritance rights, or local political relationships, communities had practical reasons to care about their legitimacy. A posthumous marriage that transferred ownership of valuable local property or changed alliance relationships could affect the entire community's future. Women's reactions to posthumous marriages were particularly complex. Some women saw these ceremonies as protective measures that could secure their economic future and legitimize their children. A posthumous marriage could transform a woman from an abandoned fiancé with no legal standing into a legitimate widow with property rights and social respect. But other women viewed posthumous marriages with horror, seeing them as grotesque parodies of what should be joyful celebrations. The idea of exchanging vows with a corpse, even for practical reasons, violated their sense of what marriage should represent. These women often became vocal opponents of the practice, influencing community opinion against posthumous marriages. Men's reactions were often influenced by their own military experiences and understanding of honor codes. Veterans who had seen friends die in battle were more likely to support posthumous marriages as ways of honoring fallen comrades and keeping promises to the dead. Men who had never faced similar situations were more likely to view the practice as unnecessary or disturbing. Children in medieval communities often reacted with fear and curiosity to posthumous marriages. These ceremonies could become formative memories that shaped attitudes toward death, marriage, and social obligation for entire generations. Some communities tried to shield children from these events, while others used them as teaching moments about duty and honor. The elderly often served as community authorities on posthumous marriages, since they were more likely to remember previous cases and understand the precedents involved. Their opinions carried significant weight in determining whether a particular posthumous marriage would be accepted or rejected by the broader community. Seasonal and agricultural concerns also influenced community reactions. Posthumous marriages held during busy harvest periods or planting seasons were less welcome than those scheduled during slower agricultural periods. Communities that were struggling with poor harvests or economic hardship were less likely to support elaborate ceremonies that seemed wasteful. Religious minorities within predominantly Christian communities sometimes had different perspectives on posthumous marriages. Jewish communities in medieval Europe had their own traditions regarding death and marriage that could conflict with Christian posthumous marriage practices. These differences sometimes created tension or required special accommodations. The role of local gossip and storytelling in shaping community reactions was enormous. Stories about posthumous marriages could be embellished, distorted, or mythologized as they passed from person to person. A ceremony that actually went smoothly might be remembered as cursed or supernatural, while a problematic posthumous marriage might be romanticized in community memory. Superstitions about posthumous marriages varied widely, but were nearly universal. Some communities believed these ceremonies could disturb the rest of all the dead in local cemeteries. Others thought they might attract demons or evil spirits. Still others worried that posthumous marriages could cause infertility, crop failures, or other community disasters. The timing of posthumous marriages in relation to religious holidays and community events also affected reactions. Ceremonies held during Lent or other solemn religious periods were more acceptable than those scheduled during festive seasons. Communities were more receptive to posthumous marriages that respected the religious calendar and social rhythms. Local political tensions could influence reactions to posthumous marriages. If the families involved were unpopular or if the marriage affected local power dynamics, communities might oppose the ceremony regardless of its legitimacy. Conversely, popular families or politically advantageous marriages might receive community support even when the practice seemed questionable. The aftermath of posthumous marriages often influenced community attitudes toward future cases. If a posthumous marriage was followed by good fortune, successful harvests, or other positive events, communities might view the practice more favorably. But if bad things happened afterward, people might blame the ceremony for bringing supernatural punishment or divine displeasure. Number 8. Real historical cases that survived in records. The monastery of Saint Denis in France holds one of the most detailed accounts of posthumous marriage in medieval Europe. In 1247, a young knight named Philippe de Montmorency was killed in a tournament just 3 weeks before his scheduled wedding to Marie de Coucy. The betrothal contract included substantial land transfers, military alliances, and a dowry worth more than 10,000 livres, an enormous sum for the period. Marie's family faced financial ruin if the marriage contract was voided. They had already borrowed heavily against the expected dowry income and committed to military support that depended on the alliance. Philippe's family had their own concerns, as his death left his inheritance in legal limbo without a clear heir. The solution was a posthumous marriage ceremony conducted in the monastery chapel with both families' full participation. The Chronicle of Saint Denis describes the event in remarkable detail. Philippe's body was preserved through a combination of herbs and wrapping techniques that kept it presentable for 8 days after death. He was dressed in silk wedding clothes specially constructed to fit around his wounds and positioned in a carved wooden chair that supported his body during the ceremony. Marie wore traditional wedding attire, but with black trim as acknowledgement of the circumstances. The ceremony itself involved modified wedding vows where Marie pledged herself to Philippe's memory and legal status rather than to the person himself. 3 bishops participated, along with representatives from both families and the local nobility. The legal documents were signed during the ceremony, transferring properties and confirming the alliance between the families. The monastery's records show that this posthumous marriage resolved inheritance disputes that might otherwise have lasted decades. From Germany comes the case of Adelheid von Meissen and Count Hermann of Thuringia in 1190. Hermann died from wounds received in the Third Crusade after having made betrothal agreements with Adelhaide's family, but before the wedding ceremony could take place. The Saxon Chronicle records that Adelhaide's father petitioned the Holy Roman Emperor for permission to complete the marriage with Hermann's body when it was returned from the Holy Land. The emperor's court spent months debating the legal and theological implications before ruling that the marriage could proceed if certain conditions were met. The ceremony had to include formal testimony about the prior betrothal agreements, church blessing from at least 2 bishops, and documentation that would stand up to future legal challenges. The posthumous marriage took place in the cathedral at Merseburg with the emperor's representative present as an official witness. The political implications of this marriage extended far beyond the immediate families. The alliance between Meissen and Thuringia affected military obligations, trade relationships, and diplomatic arrangements across the Holy Roman Empire. The posthumous marriage allowed these larger political structures to remain stable despite Hermann's death, demonstrating how these ceremonies served interests far beyond individual families. English records from the reign of Richard I provide another fascinating case. In 1194, Sir Geoffrey Fitzwalter died at the Siege of Nottingham during the civil war between Richard and his brother John. Geoffrey had been betrothed to Isabella de Clare, daughter of one of the most powerful families in Wales. The betrothal contract included military obligations that were crucial for defending the Welsh borderlands. The pipe rolls record the complex legal proceedings that surrounded Geoffrey's posthumous marriage to Isabella. The ceremony required royal permission because it affected military service obligations owed to the crown. Isabella's pregnancy added urgency to the situation, as legitimizing their child was essential for maintaining family claims to strategic Welsh territories. The posthumous marriage ceremony took place at Strigwell Castle with the Archbishop of Canterbury presiding. The legal documentation was extensive, including testimony from 8 witnesses about the prior betrothal agreements, inventories of all properties involved, and formal declarations about the military service obligations that would transfer through the marriage. Spanish records from the Reconquista period include several cases of posthumous marriages involving knights who died fighting against Muslim forces. The Chronicle of Alfonso VIII describes the case of Rodrigo de Lara, who died at the Battle of Alarcos in 1195 after betrothal, but before marriage to Elvira Fernandez. The posthumous marriage ceremony was conducted as part of Rodrigo's funeral rites, combining mourning for the dead knight with celebration of his honor and commitment. These Spanish posthumous marriages often included elements of military honor and religious crusading zeal that were less prominent in other regions. The ceremonies emphasized the deceased's sacrifice for Christian Spain and portrayed the posthumous marriage as a way of honoring both personal commitment and religious duty. Italian records from the city-states provide examples of posthumous marriages motivated primarily by commercial considerations. The Venetian archives include detailed documentation of the 1298 posthumous marriage between Lorenzo Dandolo and Caterina Morosini. Lorenzo died of fever while returning from a trading expedition to Constantinople, but the commercial agreements tied to their betrothal were too valuable to abandon. The Venetian ceremony was notable for its emphasis on business documentation rather than religious ritual. The posthumous marriage was conducted in the presence of merchants, bankers, and legal officials who could testify about the commercial implications. The ceremony included formal readings of trade agreements, property transfers, and business partnerships that would be affected by the marriage. Nordic sources provide some of the most dramatic examples of posthumous marriage, often involving warriors who died in battle. The Heimskringla includes the story of Olaf Haraldsson and Astrid Olafsdotter in 1030. Olaf died at the Battle of Stiklestad after betrothal, but before marriage, and his body was brought back for a posthumous marriage ceremony that included traditional Norse elements alongside Christian rituals. The ceremony combined Christian marriage liturgy with Norse traditions of honoring dead warriors. Astrid pledged herself to Olaf's memory using traditional Norse wedding vows, while priests provided Christian blessings. The ceremony included the exchange of rings and the sharing of ceremonial ale, adapted to accommodate Olaf's death. Byzantine records provide perhaps the most legally sophisticated examples of posthumous marriage. The Alexiad mentions the case of John Komnenos and Anna Damascene in 1176, where complex inheritance laws made posthumous marriage the only way to resolve competing claims to valuable properties in Anatolia. The Byzantine ceremony followed elaborate court protocols that had been developed specifically for unusual legal situations. The posthumous marriage was conducted in the presence of imperial officials, church authorities, and legal experts who could ensure that all procedural requirements were met. The documentation was so thorough that it served as a legal precedent for decades afterward. These historical cases reveal that posthumous marriages weren't just bizarre curiosities, but practical solutions to real legal, political, and economic problems. The detailed records that survive show medieval people approaching these unusual ceremonies with the same careful attention they gave to any important legal proceeding. They weren't being morbid or superstitious. They were being pragmatic about the complex realities of medieval life. Number 9. From medieval Europe to other cultures. While medieval Europeans were developing their own traditions of posthumous marriage, similar practices were emerging independently across the globe. The human tendency to use marriage ceremonies to solve practical problems after death wasn't limited to Christian Europe, and examining these other traditions reveals how universal some of these concerns really were. Ancient China had perhaps the most elaborate and long-lasting tradition of posthumous marriage, known as Minghun, or spirit marriage. These ceremonies dated back over 3,000 years and continued in various forms well into the modern era. Chinese posthumous marriages served many of the same functions as European ones, legitimizing children, transferring property, and maintaining family honor, but they were embedded in a completely different religious and social system. Chinese spirit marriages were often arranged between families whose children had died young and unmarried. The belief was that unmarried spirits were lonely and potentially dangerous to the living. By arranging posthumous marriages, families could ensure that their deceased children had companions in the afterlife and wouldn't return as unhappy ghosts to trouble their relatives. The ceremonies themselves could be incredibly elaborate, rivaling or even exceeding regular weddings in their complexity. Bodies were exhumed, dressed in wedding clothes, and positioned for formal ceremonies that included all the traditional elements of Chinese weddings. The families exchanged gifts, performed traditional rituals, and held banquets to celebrate the union of their dead children. What's particularly fascinating about Chinese posthumous marriages is how they evolved over thousands of years while maintaining their essential functions. During different dynasties, the specific rituals changed, but the underlying purposes remained constant. These ceremonies continued to legitimize inheritance, strengthen family alliances, and provide spiritual comfort to bereaved parents. Ancient Egypt had its own traditions of posthumous relationships that served similar functions to marriage. The complex Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife created situations where relationships with the dead had legal and spiritual significance for the living. While not exactly marriages in the medieval European sense, these ceremonies accomplished many of the same practical and emotional goals. Egyptian posthumous relationships often involved continuing obligations between the living and the dead. Surviving spouses or family members would make offerings, maintain tombs, and perform rituals that were understood as ongoing relationships rather than simple memorial practices. These obligations could affect inheritance, property rights, and family status in ways that paralleled European posthumous marriages. The elaborate mummification and burial practices of ancient Egypt created opportunities for posthumous ceremonies that were impossible in cultures with simpler burial traditions. Bodies preserved through mummification could be available for ceremonies months or years after death, allowing for complex legal and religious procedures that required extensive preparation. Hindu traditions in medieval India included practices that functioned similarly to posthumous marriage, though they were embedded in the completely different religious framework of karma, reincarnation, and dharma. When someone died after betrothal but before marriage, families sometimes performed ceremonies that completed the spiritual obligations and resolved the practical problems that the death had created. These Hindu ceremonies were less focused on the physical presence of corpses and more concerned with the spiritual and social relationships that death had disrupted. The rituals emphasized the continuation of dharmic obligations, the proper completion of family duties, and the maintenance of social harmony despite the disruption of death. The caste system in medieval India created additional complexities around posthumous marriage-like ceremonies. Different castes had different obligations and restrictions regarding death, marriage, and spiritual practice. What was appropriate for one caste might be forbidden for another, creating a complex system of posthumous ceremonies that varied dramatically across social groups. Buddhist cultures in medieval Asia had their own approaches to posthumous relationships that served some of the same functions as European posthumous marriages. The Buddhist understanding of death and rebirth created different spiritual frameworks, but the practical problems of interrupted betrothals, illegitimate children, and disrupted family alliances remained similar. Buddhist posthumous ceremonies often emphasized the merit-making aspects of completing interrupted obligations. Families could gain spiritual merit by honoring agreements made with the deceased, supporting their surviving relatives, and maintaining the social harmony that their death had disrupted. These ceremonies were less about marriage per se and more about completing karmic obligations. Islamic cultures in medieval times had restrictions against posthumous marriage based on religious law, but they developed other mechanisms for addressing the practical problems that European posthumous marriages were designed to solve. Islamic inheritance law, marriage regulations, and family obligations provided alternative ways to legitimize children, transfer property, and maintain family honor after unexpected death. The detailed Islamic legal traditions meant that scholars and judges had sophisticated tools for resolving inheritance disputes, legitimacy questions, and property transfers without resorting to posthumous marriage ceremonies. The solutions were different, but they addressed many of the same underlying problems that motivated posthumous marriages in Christian Europe. Jewish communities in medieval Europe and elsewhere had their own religious restrictions against posthumous marriage, but like Islamic cultures, they developed alternative mechanisms for addressing similar problems. Jewish law provided specific procedures for resolving inheritance questions, legitimizing children, and maintaining family obligations that didn't require posthumous ceremonies. The Halitza ceremony in Jewish law, performed when a man died without children, served some similar functions to posthumous marriage by resolving inheritance questions and clarifying family obligations. While not a marriage to a dead person, it was a ritualized ceremony that addressed the practical problems that death created for family relationships. Native American cultures had diverse traditions regarding death and ongoing relationships with the deceased. Some tribes had ceremonies that maintained spiritual connections between the living and the dead that served protective, spiritual, and practical functions. While not marriages in the European sense, these ceremonies demonstrated the universal human tendency to formalize ongoing relationships with the deceased when such relationships served important social functions. African cultures had their own rich traditions of ancestor veneration and ongoing relationships with the dead. These practices served many of the same functions as European posthumous marriages, maintaining family continuity, resolving inheritance questions, and providing spiritual protection for the living. The specific forms varied enormously across different African cultures, but the underlying human needs were remarkably consistent. The global perspective on posthumous marriage-like ceremonies reveals something important about human nature and social organization. Across different religions, cultures, and historical periods, people have consistently developed ritualized ways to maintain relationships with the dead when such relationships served important practical or spiritual purposes. The specific forms varied, but the underlying human needs remained remarkably consistent. Number 10. The slow death of the practice. The end of posthumous marriage in Europe wasn't sudden or dramatic. Like many medieval practices, it faded gradually as the world around it changed, becoming first unusual, then scandalous, and finally forgotten. The forces that killed this practice were the same ones that transformed medieval Europe into the modern world: centralized government, standardized law, reformed religion, and changing attitudes toward death, marriage, and individual rights. The Protestant Reformation dealt one of the first major blows to posthumous marriage. Protestant theology emphasized the direct relationship between individuals and God, reducing the role of ritual, ceremony, and church hierarchy in validating human relationships. Martin Luther and other reformers argued that marriage was a civil contract rather than a sacrament, which removed much of the theological justification for posthumous ceremonies. More importantly, Protestant churches developed more standardized and centralized practices that left less room for local variation and unusual ceremonies. Where Catholic priests had often made individual decisions about posthumous marriages based on local circumstances, Protestant ministers were expected to follow more uniform guidelines that typically excluded such practices. The Council of Trent, the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, also worked against posthumous marriage by standardizing Catholic marriage practices across Europe. The council required that valid marriages include specific procedures, documentation, and church involvement that were difficult to accomplish with dead bodies. While not explicitly banning posthumous marriage, these new requirements made it much more difficult to perform legitimately. Legal centralization was equally important in ending posthumous marriage. Medieval Europe's patchwork of feudal law, local custom, and competing authorities had created the loopholes that made posthumous marriage possible. As kingdoms developed more centralized legal systems, standardized courts, and professional legal classes, these loopholes were systematically closed. The rise of nation-states meant that marriage law became increasingly uniform within large territories. Local variations and special circumstances were less tolerated when they conflicted with royal authority or standardized legal codes. Posthumous marriage, which had thrived in the chaos of competing legal systems, couldn't survive in more organized legal environments. Economic changes also worked against posthumous marriage. The medieval feudal system, with its complex web of personal obligations and land-based wealth, had created many of the problems that posthumous marriage was designed to solve. As Europe developed more sophisticated banking, insurance, and commercial law, alternative methods for handling inheritance, property transfer, and business obligations became available. The growth of cities and commercial capitalism changed marriage patterns themselves. Urban marriages were less likely to involve complex land transfers or military obligations. Commercial wealth was easier to transfer than feudal property rights. Business partnerships could be restructured more easily than feudal alliances. The practical problems that had motivated posthumous marriage became less common and easier to solve through other means. Changing attitudes toward death played a crucial role in ending posthumous marriage. The medieval world's familiarity with death and corpses had made posthumous ceremonies less shocking than they would later become. But by the Renaissance and early modern periods, European attitudes toward death were becoming more distant and sanitized. The development of professional medical practice, improved public health, and more sophisticated funeral industries moved death out of the home and into specialized institutions. People became less comfortable with corpses and less willing to include them in elaborate ceremonies. What had once seemed practical began to seem morbid and inappropriate. Changing concepts of individual rights and personal autonomy also worked against posthumous marriage. Medieval society had been comfortable with the idea that family, community, and political obligations could override individual preferences. But Renaissance humanism and early modern philosophy increasingly emphasized individual choice and personal consent in marriage. The idea that someone could be married without their conscious consent became increasingly problematic as European culture developed stronger concepts of individual rights. Even if the deceased had previously consented to marriage, the idea of conducting the ceremony after death began to seem like a violation of personal autonomy. Literacy and education also contributed to the decline of posthumous marriage. As more people learned to read and write, they became more familiar with standardized legal procedures and less dependent on local custom and oral tradition. Written contracts, documented procedures, and formal legal training reduced the ambiguity that had made posthumous marriage possible. The development of insurance, banking, and other financial instruments provided alternative ways to handle the economic problems that had motivated posthumous marriage. Rather than marrying a corpse to claim inheritance rights, surviving partners could rely on written contracts, insurance policies, and standardized legal procedures. Medical advances that reduced mortality rates also made posthumous marriage less necessary. As fewer people died young, and as diseases became more treatable, the situation that had often created the need for posthumous marriage became less common. People were more likely to live long enough to complete their planned marriages. The growth of professional legal and medical classes created new authorities who were skeptical of posthumous marriage. Lawyers trained in standardized legal procedures and doctors with scientific medical training were less likely to support practices that seemed to violate professional standards or scientific understanding. By the 17th and 18th centuries, posthumous marriage had become rare enough to seem exotic and scandalous. The practice that had once been accepted as a practical solution to real problems was now viewed as a bizarre relic of a more primitive age. The few attempts at posthumous marriage that occurred were widely criticized and often legally challenged. The final blow came from changing religious and philosophical attitudes toward marriage itself. The Romantic movement and changing concepts of love transformed marriage from a practical arrangement into an emotional and spiritual union between living individuals. The idea of marrying for love made posthumous marriage seem not just impractical, but fundamentally wrong. By the 19th century, posthumous marriage had become so foreign to European culture that historians and anthropologists studying medieval records often dismissed accounts of these ceremonies as folklore or exaggeration. The practice had not only ended but had been largely forgotten, surviving mainly in obscure legal documents and church records that few people ever read. Today, posthumous marriage survives only in a few very specific legal contexts, usually involving military benefits or inheritance rights. France, for example, still allows posthumous marriage in rare cases involving soldiers who die before planned weddings. But these are exceptional circumstances that require extensive legal procedures and government approval. The story of posthumous marriage's decline reveals how thoroughly European culture transformed between the medieval and modern periods. Practices that had once seemed practical and honorable became unthinkable. Legal systems that had once been flexible became standardized. Religious attitudes that had once accommodated unusual circumstances became rigid. And social attitudes that had once prioritized family and community obligations shifted toward individual rights and personal choice. Yet the very fact that we're still talking about posthumous marriage today reveals something important about human nature and social needs. The problems that motivated these ceremonies, inheritance rights, family obligations, legitimacy questions, and the desire to honor agreements with the dead, haven't entirely disappeared. We've simply developed different ways of addressing them that fit better with modern values and institutions. The medieval practice of marrying dead bodies reminds us that human societies have always found ways to adapt their most fundamental institutions to meet practical needs, even when those adaptations seem strange or shocking to later generations. These ceremonies weren't evidence of primitive thinking or morbid obsession, but of the complex creativity that humans bring to solving social problems. And perhaps that's why these stories still fascinate us today. In our own world of complex legal systems, insurance policies, and standardized procedures, we can still recognize the basic human needs that drove medieval families to dress corpses in wedding clothes and speak vows to the dead. We've found different solutions, but the underlying human needs for continuity, legitimacy, honor, and the resolution of obligations that transcend death remain surprisingly familiar. So the next time you're struggling with bureaucracy, inheritance law, or family obligations, remember that your medieval ancestors faced similar challenges with fewer resources and more creative solutions. They didn't have insurance companies or professional legal systems, but they had ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to find practical answers to impossible problems. Even if those answers sometimes involved saying, "I do," to someone who couldn't say it back. And here we are, at the end of our journey through one of history's most bizarre and surprisingly logical practices. We've spent the last 2 hours exploring a world where people married dead bodies, where corpses were dressed in silk and positioned at altars, where families spent fortunes on ceremonies with participants who couldn't say, "I do" back. It sounds like something from a horror movie, but as we've seen, it was just Tuesday in medieval Europe. So what does all of this mean? Why should we care about something that happened centuries ago and seems so foreign to our modern sensibilities? The answer lies not just in understanding the past, but in understanding ourselves and the unchanging human needs that drove these extraordinary ceremonies. First, let's acknowledge what we've really been talking about here. Posthumous marriage wasn't some primitive superstition or evidence of medieval barbarism. It was a sophisticated legal and social tool developed by people facing real problems with limited resources. These weren't crazy people doing crazy things. They were practical individuals finding creative solutions to impossible situations. Think about the underlying issues that drove these ceremonies. A woman pregnant with a dead soldier's child, facing a lifetime of poverty and social disgrace. A family that had invested their entire fortune in a marriage alliance, watching their economic future disappear with their son's death. Two noble houses whose military alliance could determine whether their lands would be defended or conquered. These weren't abstract problems. They were matters of survival, honor, and family continuity. Medieval Europe didn't have insurance companies to compensate for unexpected deaths. They didn't have social safety nets to support single mothers. They didn't have professional legal systems to resolve inheritance disputes quickly and fairly. They didn't have standardized procedures for transferring property or maintaining business relationships after death. What they had was ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to adapt their most sacred institutions to meet practical needs. And that adaptability reveals something profound about human nature. When faced with problems that existing systems can't solve, humans don't just give up. They innovate. They find loopholes. They create new rituals and ceremonies that meet their needs, even when those solutions seem strange or shocking to outsiders. The medieval practice of posthumous marriage is a testament to human creativity in the face of impossible circumstances. But there's another level to this story that's even more relevant to our modern world. These ceremonies weren't just about solving immediate practical problems. They were about maintaining continuity in the face of disruption. They were about honoring commitments that transcended individual mortality. They were about the belief that some obligations and relationships are so important that death itself cannot void them. This touches on something universal in human experience. We all face the question of what survives when we die. Not in a religious sense necessarily, but in terms of our obligations, our relationships, our promises, and our impact on the people we leave behind. Medieval posthumous marriage was one culture's answer to these universal questions. Consider how we handle similar issues today. We have life insurance policies that provide for our families after death. We write wills that distribute our property according to our wishes. We create trusts and legal structures that continue our financial obligations. We establish foundations and memorials that preserve our values and commitments. In many ways, these modern institutions serve the same functions that posthumous marriage served in medieval Europe. The difference is that we've learned to separate the practical from the ceremonial. We handle the legal and financial aspects of death through impersonal institutions, while reserving ceremony for grief, memory, and spiritual comfort. Medieval people combined these functions in single rituals that addressed both practical and emotional needs simultaneously. There's something both efficient and profound about their approach. A posthumous marriage ceremony didn't just transfer property and legitimize children. It also provided closure for grieving families, honored the memory of the deceased, and reaffirmed community values about loyalty, duty, and the sanctity of agreements. Our modern approach is more systematic, but perhaps less emotionally satisfying. The global perspective we explored also reveals the universality of these human needs. Chinese spirit marriages, ancient Egyptian posthumous relationships, Hindu dharmic obligations, and various indigenous traditions all developed different solutions to similar problems. The specific forms varied enormously, but the underlying human needs remained remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. This suggests that the impulse to maintain relationships and obligations beyond death isn't a quirk of medieval European culture, but something fundamental to human social organization. We are creatures who make promises, form bonds, and create obligations that we expect to transcend our individual mortality. When death disrupts these relationships, we find ways to honor them, whether through elaborate ceremonies or sophisticated legal instruments. The decline of posthumous marriage also tells us something important about social change and cultural evolution. These practices didn't disappear because they were inherently wrong or because people suddenly became more enlightened. They disappeared because the world changed around them. Legal systems became more sophisticated. Economic structures became more complex. Religious institutions became more standardized. Social values shifted toward individual rights and personal autonomy. But the human needs that motivated posthumous marriage didn't disappear. They were rechanneled into new institutions and practices that served the same functions while fitting better with changing social values. We still legitimize children, transfer property, honor the dead, and maintain family continuity. We just do it differently. This process of institutional evolution is happening constantly in our own world. Practices that seem normal and necessary today will probably seem bizarre to future generations, just as posthumous marriage seems bizarre to us. But if we understand the human needs underlying our current institutions, we might be more prepared to adapt them as circumstances change. The story of posthumous marriage also reminds us to be humble about our own cultural assumptions. It's easy to look back at medieval people marrying corpses and feel superior about our more enlightened approach to death and marriage. But our descendants might look back at our practices with equal bewilderment. They might wonder why we spent fortunes on elaborate funeral ceremonies, why we preserved bodies in expensive caskets, or why we maintained expensive cemetery plots for decades after death. Every generation thinks its own practices are rational, while viewing those of previous generations as primitive or bizarre. But history suggests that most human institutions, no matter how strange they seem to outsiders, develop for good reasons and serve real human needs. Understanding those reasons and needs is more valuable than simply judging past practices by current standards. There's also a lesson here about the relationship between law and society. Medieval posthumous marriage existed in the gaps between different legal systems, thriving in the ambiguity created by overlapping authorities and competing traditions. As legal systems became more centralized and standardized, these gaps were closed and the practice disappeared. This process continues today. Our own legal systems have gaps and ambiguities that allow for practices future generations might find equally strange. The intersection of technology and law is creating new gray areas that people are exploiting in creative ways. Virtual relationships, digital inheritance, artificial intelligence rights, and biotechnology are all creating situations that existing legal frameworks weren't designed to handle. How we address these challenges might seem as strange to future observers as posthumous marriage seems to us. But the underlying human impulse to find practical solutions to new problems remains constant. We're still adapting our institutions to meet changing needs, just as medieval people did with their elaborate ceremonies involving dressed corpses and modified wedding vows. The emotional aspect of posthumous marriage also deserves reflection. These ceremonies weren't just cold legal proceedings. They were deeply emotional events for the families involved. Imagine the grief of a mother watching her dead son's wedding, the complex feelings of a woman pledging herself to a corpse, the community tension surrounding such unusual ceremonies. These emotional dimensions remind us that all legal and social institutions have human costs and benefits that go beyond their practical functions. The people who participated in posthumous marriages weren't just solving legal problems. They were working through complex emotions about death, duty, love, and loss. Their solutions might seem strange to us, but their emotional struggles remain recognizable and universal. Modern grief counseling, funeral rituals, and memorial practices serve some of the same emotional functions that posthumous marriage served in medieval Europe. We still need ways to process loss, honor relationships that death has interrupted, and find meaning in tragedy. The specific forms have changed, but the underlying human needs persist. Perhaps most importantly, the story of posthumous marriage challenges us to think more creatively about our own institutions and practices. When we face problems that existing systems can't solve, do we have the courage and imagination to develop new approaches? Are we willing to adapt our most sacred institutions when circumstances require it? Medieval people were willing to modify the sacrament of marriage itself to meet practical needs. They didn't let tradition, convention, or squeamishness prevent them from finding solutions that worked. This doesn't mean we should uncritically adopt their specific practices, but we might learn from their flexibility and creativity. Our own world faces challenges that existing institutions weren't designed to handle. Climate change, artificial intelligence, global inequality, and other contemporary problems might require institutional innovations that seem as strange to current observers as posthumous marriage seemed to medieval communities. The question is whether we have the institutional flexibility and creative courage to develop appropriate responses. The story of posthumous marriage also illustrates the importance of historical perspective in understanding human behavior. These practices seem bizarre when viewed in isolation, but they make sense when understood in their proper context. This suggests that we should be cautious about judging contemporary practices in other cultures or historical periods without understanding the circumstances that created them. It also suggests that our own practices might benefit from historical perspective. How will future generations view our approach to death, marriage, family obligations, and legal systems? What assumptions are we making that might seem obviously wrong to later observers? Historical humility might make us more open to questioning our own institutions and more willing to consider alternative approaches. Finally, the story of posthumous marriage reminds us that human societies have always been more creative, adaptable, and complex than we often assume. The past wasn't a simple, primitive time when people didn't think clearly about their problems. Medieval Europeans developed sophisticated solutions to complex social challenges, even when those solutions required them to dress corpses in wedding clothes and conduct ceremonies that combined legal proceedings with funeral rites. This creativity and adaptability gives us reason for optimism about our own ability to address contemporary challenges. If medieval people could develop posthumous marriage to solve inheritance disputes and legitimize children, surely we can develop appropriate institutions to handle artificial intelligence, climate change, and global inequality. The specific solutions will be different, but the underlying human capacity for institutional innovation remains constant. The practice of posthumous marriage ultimately tells us something profound about what it means to be human. We are creatures who form bonds that we expect to transcend death, who make promises we intend to keep even when circumstances make fulfillment difficult, and who create institutions that serve both practical and emotional needs simultaneously. When medieval families arranged marriages between living women and dead men, they weren't being morbid or primitive. They were being profoundly human, refusing to let death have the final word on relationships that mattered to them. They were honoring commitments, protecting the vulnerable, maintaining family continuity, and finding meaning in tragedy. These are still human needs. The forms have changed, but the underlying impulses remain recognizable. We still honor our dead through memorial services, maintain relationships with them through grief rituals, and create institutions that continue their work after they're gone. We still struggle with questions about what survives death, how to honor interrupted relationships, and how to balance individual desires with family and community obligations. The medieval practice of posthumous marriage was one culture's response to these eternal human challenges. It wasn't the only possible response, and it wasn't necessarily the best response, but it was a deeply human response that served real needs for the people who practiced it. Understanding this practice doesn't require us to approve of it or adopt it for ourselves, but it does require us to recognize the human needs it served and to reflect on how we address similar needs in our own time and place. It challenges us to be more creative, more flexible, and more compassionate in developing institutions that serve both practical and emotional human needs. As we close this exploration of one of history's most unusual marriage practices, remember that every human society has developed strange-seeming solutions to universal problems. Our descendants will probably view some of our own practices with equal bewilderment. But if we can learn from the creativity and adaptability of our ancestors, we might be better prepared to develop appropriate responses to our own challenges. The medieval people who married dead bodies weren't so different from us. They faced impossible situations with limited resources and found ways to honor their commitments, protect their families, and maintain social stability. They adapted their most sacred institutions to meet practical needs while preserving their essential meaning and purpose. That's not barbarism. That's not primitive thinking. That's human ingenuity at its most creative and compassionate. And it's a reminder that when we face our own impossible situations, we too might need to think beyond conventional solutions and develop new ways of honoring our deepest commitments to each other. Whether we're dealing with the death of a loved one, the collapse of an institution, or the emergence of unprecedented challenges, the story of posthumous marriage reminds us that human creativity and adaptability can find ways forward even in the most difficult circumstances. Sometimes those ways forward might seem strange to observers, but they can still serve real human needs with dignity and purpose. The corpse brides and posthumous grooms of medieval Europe have been dead for centuries, but their story continues to teach us about the enduring human capacity to find meaning and maintain relationships even in the face of death itself. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether we're planning our own futures or trying to understand our complicated past. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most unusual practices. I hope it's given you a new perspective on both medieval Europe and our own contemporary world. If you enjoyed this exploration, let me know in the comments what other forgotten historical practices you'd like to see covered. And remember to like and subscribe if you want more deep dives into the strange, shocking, and surprisingly logical world of our ancestors. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about the past, and remember that every human society, including our own, has found creative ways to address the eternal challenges of love, death, duty, and survival. Sometimes those ways might involve saying "I do" to someone who can't say it back, but they always reveal something important about what it means to be human.